What happens when a country knows it cannot win a war outright? So instead, it decides to make everyone else pay for it, one burning ship at a time. That is exactly the strategy playing out right now in the waters near the Strait of Hormuz, and last night gave us the clearest proof yet of how far it's willing to go. Quick ask before we dive in. If you want breakdowns like this delivered straight, honest, and without the noise, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update, and share this with someone who still thinks this conflict wound down months ago, because it absolutely did not. Let's get into it. Two tankers caught fire within hours of each other last night on two completely different coastlines. And the connection between them tells you almost everything you need to understand about where this war actually stands. One was hit near Oman, close to the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. The other was hit far to the north in the Red Sea near a Saudi export terminal that was supposed to be one of the safer alternatives to sailing through the strait at all. Different attackers, different flags, same underlying message. If you thought there was a safe route left to move oil out of this region, that assumption just failed a very public test. Before we get into exactly what happened, it helps to understand why this stretch of water matters so much that two separate campaigns are burning real money fighting over it week after week. The Strait of Hormuz narrows to barely 20 miles wide at its tightest point, and on a normal day before any of this started, something close to a fifth of the entire world's oil supply moved through that gap. This is not a regional choke point, it is a global one. Squeeze it, even a little, and the effects ripple into shipping insurance markets, refinery planning, and government energy policy on nearly every continent. So when pressure builds around this exact spot, it is never accidental. It is the one lever in the entire region guaranteed to draw the whole world's attention every single time someone decides to pull it. Let's start with the strike near Oman, because this one tells you the most about how this conflict is actually being fought right now. Just after midnight local time, the Maritime Monitoring Center that tracks incidents in this region logged a strike a few nautical miles off the Omani coast. A projectile hit the engine room of an oil tanker and stopped it dead in the water almost immediately. The crew was reported safe. Nobody has explained exactly what caused the damage, and as of this recording, nobody has stepped forward to claim responsibility. Sit with that phrase for a second, because in most conflicts, an unclaimed strike would be a genuine mystery. In this one, it is closer to routine. This is the same stretch of water where mines have been laid quietly for months, where shipping has been harassed again and again, and where the kind of slow, low-flying drone that could put a hole through an engine room from a distance has become a familiar part of the landscape. When something like this happens in the waters approaching Hormuz, and nobody claims it, that silence is not really evidence of doubt. It is closer to a deliberate choice. Think about what it actually takes to pull off an attack like this and leave absolutely no fingerprints behind. It is not luck. It requires planning a launch point far enough from any monitored coastline, timing the strike for the hours when patrol coverage is thinnest, and choosing a target specifically because disabling it sends a message without crossing the kind of line that would force an immediate, undeniable military response. Every part of that requires preparation, not improvisation, which is exactly why the absence of a claim tells you more about intent than confusion ever could. And that choice reveals something important. Iran has spent this entire conflict trying to have it both ways. It wants the economic disruption that comes from destabilizing the strait, without absorbing the full diplomatic and military cost of openly declaring war on every ship that sails through it. An unclaimed drone strike gets you exactly that outcome. It spikes insurance premiums. It pushes shipping companies to quietly reroute around the danger zone, and it lets officials go on record insisting they had nothing to do with it, all while the disruption does its work in the background. That is not a sign of strength. It is important to be clear about that, because it is easy to look at a disabled tanker and assume the side responsible must be winning. What this actually tells you is that direct confrontation is off the table. The Navy behind this campaign is not contesting warships in open water. Its air power is not contesting fighter jets in the sky. What remains in the toolbox is exactly this: cheap, deniable, asymmetric harassment designed to make the economics of this war more painful for everyone else than it is for the country running it. There is a financial layer here that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Every time a tanker gets disabled near this strait, war risk. Insurance premiums for the entire region tick upward again. Ship owners then have to weigh whether the extra premium or the extra time and fuel cost of a much longer route around the southern tip of Africa is worth avoiding the risk altogether. So a single disabled engine room off the Omani coast does not just take one ship out of service. It quietly raises the cost of doing business for every vessel operator still willing to run that gauntlet. And that slow, grinding pressure is precisely what this strategy is counting on. Now let's move to the other coastline, because the strike near the Saudi export terminal is a completely different kind of message. And if you miss the distinction, you miss the real story. Within the hour, the group behind the second attack claimed credit publicly for a missile strike on a Saudi-flagged supertanker in the northern Red Sea. A fire broke out on the main deck. Nearby vessels reportedly moved away. Multiple independent sources confirmed the strike, along with the shipping company that operates the vessel. The crew was accounted for, with no injuries and no confirmed pollution reported. Here's the detail that should really stop you in your tracks. This location sits far north of the traditional danger zone near the southern mouth of the Red Sea, the area that has been targeted for years now. This strike happened close to the heart of Saudi Arabia's remaining export infrastructure. That is not route harassment anymore. That is a direct message that there is no safe detour left. If sailing north to avoid the main choke point felt like a reasonable workaround, last night proved that assumption wrong. This matters even more when you realize why that particular port became so important in the first place. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively strangled for months, Saudi Arabia has leaned heavily on this northern route as one of its main remaining outlets to keep crude moving to the world market. Analysts tracking regional shipping data have already noted a meaningful drop in export volume from that port since attacks widened into the northern Red Sea. Every strike up there is not just a headline. It is a direct hit against the one workaround that has been keeping Saudi exports flowing. Step back and look at the bigger shape of this. One force is squeezing the strait itself. An allied group is squeezing the alternate route through the Red Sea. Two different flags, two different campaigns, two different stretches of water, and one shared goal. Make sure there is no cheap way to move oil out of this region without someone, somewhere, having to accept real risk. That is not random escalation. That is a deliberate pincer built patiently over months. Think about this from the perspective of the country caught in the middle. Saudi Arabia is not even a direct combatant in the underlying conflict between Iran and the coalition opposing it, yet it keeps getting hit anyway, simply because it sits geographically inside the blast radius of this pressure campaign. Every barrel that gets rerouted away from the strait was meant to flow out instead through pipelines cutting across the peninsula toward terminals in the north, specifically so the kingdom would not be as exposed to whatever happens near Hormuz. That workaround has functioned as a genuine lifeline for months. Now that the northern route has been shown to be reachable too, the entire premise behind that alternate path looks a lot less secure than it did even a few weeks ago. Reports already suggest an improvised shuttle system has been stood up, moving crude by tanker further along the coast and through pipelines toward the Mediterranean just to keep some exports flowing, while the north grows more dangerous by the week. If any part of this is starting to reshape how you see this conflict, that is exactly the point of breaking it down like this. Take a second, tap that like button, and if you have a prediction about where the next strike lands, drop it in the comments, because I genuinely want to see who calls it right before we find out together. Now, let's talk about the other side of this fight, because if you only watch the attacks and never watch the response, you walk away with a badly distorted picture of who is actually losing this war of attrition. The public record kept on the naval pressure campaign against Iranian shipping tells a very specific story. And that story is one of intensifying pressure, not stalling. Vessels have been redirected by the dozens. A handful have been disabled outright when they attempted to run past the blockade line. A number have been boarded to forced compliance. At the same time, vessels carrying humanitarian cargo have consistently been waved through without incident, which matters, because it undercuts the idea that this is some blanket siege on an entire population. It is targeted. It is methodical. And week over week, the number of vessels intercepted keeps climbing rather than leveling off. Here's the part that deserves far more attention than it gets. Even with a naval blockade running for months, tracking data has recently shown daily crossings through the strait ticking upward, not downward. That sounds like a contradiction until you understand what it actually reflects. The vessels the enforcing side wants moving through are moving through. Escorted convoys, Allied flag tankers, humanitarian cargo, all facilitated. The vessels trying to slip past on the opposing side's terms are the ones getting turned back, boarded, or disabled. Two very different categories of ship, producing two very different outcomes, and the total crossing number alone does not tell you which is which unless you actually dig into what is being counted. Now here's the piece of this conflict that I think deserves far more attention than it currently gets. How the response is actually knocking these drones and small boats out of the sky and out of the water on a budget that would make most defense analysts do a double take. For months, one of the workhorses quietly doing this job has been a rocket most people outside defense circles have never heard of. It is a laser-guided rocket system built around a basic airframe that has been sitting in inventories for decades, retrofitted with a guidance kit that turns an old, simple rocket into a precision weapon. Think of it as taking the cheapest thing already sitting in the warehouse and giving it eyes. The guidance kit itself has a genuinely interesting backstory. It was not originally designed with drone swarms in mind at all. It was developed years ago for an entirely different kind of conflict, because commanders at the time needed a way to eliminate a single vehicle without leveling an entire city block around it. Minimizing collateral damage was the whole point. Now, that same piece of hardware turns out to be almost perfectly suited to picking off a slow, low-flying attack drone without needing to spend a much more expensive missile to do it. That cost gap is not a small detail. In a lot of ways, it is the whole story. A single advanced medium-range missile can cost well over $1 million. Even a shorter range, heat-seeking missile runs into the mid-hundreds of thousands. This laser-guided rocket costs a small fraction of either, and you can fit half a dozen or more of them onto a single aircraft. So when a fighter takes off and gets vectored into a drone swarm, the pilot is not rationing a handful of expensive missiles across the entire sky. They are rolling in with dozens of cheap, disposable interceptors, able to cover the airspace instead of picking and choosing which threats matter most. Multiply that math across months of operations, and you start to understand why relatively few tankers have actually been hit compared to how many attacks have actually been launched. It is not that the attacking side has suddenly become more careful. It is that a huge share of what is being thrown at these ships is getting knocked down before it ever reaches the water. The production numbers behind this system are genuinely striking. The manufacturer has been running full-rate production on this guidance kit for well over a decade, and earlier this year crossed a major milestone in total units delivered. There is already a multi-year contract in place to keep tens of thousands more flowing through the pipeline over the coming years. There is also a newer version reportedly in development with an infrared seeker, which would let it lock onto a target completely independent of a laser designator, essentially giving it a fire and forget capability that would make engaging a whole cluster of drones at once far more efficient. So when officials talk tough about consequences and options that remain on the table, what they are actually gesturing at is a limited stockpile of expensive drones and short-range missiles going up against an opponent, with what amounts to a functionally unlimited supply of cheap interceptors, and no sign of running out anytime soon. That is not a sustainable trade over the long run, and everyone doing the actual math on this understands it, even if the public rhetoric does not reflect that reality. There's also a broader lesson buried in here about how modern militaries are adapting to drone warfare, and it applies well beyond this one conflict. For years, the assumption in defense circles was that answering a cheap drone threat required some expensive, high-tech countermeasure, whether that is a directed energy weapon or a next-generation interceptor missile. Those systems are absolutely being developed, and some are already being tested in the same theater. But the unglamorous truth showing up in the actual intercept data is that a huge share of the real work is being done by a rocket older than some of the pilots flying it, simply because someone figured out how to bolt a cheap guidance kit onto it. That pattern tends to repeat itself in every conflict involving drones. The side that wins the cost exchange usually is not the side with the flashiest new weapon. It is the side that figures out how to make its existing inventory smarter and cheaper per kill. Now let's talk about the diplomacy sitting underneath all of this violence, because there is an actual peace track running in parallel with the missiles, and it is worth understanding who is trying to broker it. One outside government has quietly positioned itself as one of the few players maintaining open lines of communication with both sides at once. A senior military delegation recently traveled for direct talks focused on reopenings, the Strait, and reviving broader negotiations to bring the wider conflict to an end. That trip wrapped up right around the same window as this latest round of strikes, which tells you two things. First, that there is a genuine diplomatic push happening behind the scenes, not just posturing for the cameras. Second, that whoever launched the unclaimed strike near Oman clearly was not interested in giving that diplomacy any room to breathe. That is a pattern worth flagging, because it has shown up before in this conflict. Every time there is real momentum toward talks, an unclaimed strike shows up almost on cue to reset the temperature, whether that reflects a deliberate spoiler tactic from hardliners who do not want to deal, or simply the unavoidable byproduct of a network of proxies that does not fully answer to central negotiators. The effect is the same either way. It keeps the war hot at exactly the moment the diplomatic track starts looking promising. The mediator's involvement here is also worth sitting with, because it is not an obvious choice on paper. That government has to balance a genuine security relationship with Gulf states, a historically complicated relationship with Washington, and a long, occasionally tense border relationship with Iran, all at the same time. But that same balancing act is exactly what makes it useful in this specific role. It is one of the only capitals that can pick up the phone to either side without either side assuming the call is a setup. Whether that translates into an actual breakthrough is a separate question entirely. And if the pattern of unclaimed strikes time suspiciously close to diplomatic visits continues, it is going to keep undermining the credibility of any mediator, no matter how well positioned they are on paper. If you're still with me at this point, you already understand this conflict better than most people scrolling past a 2-line headline about it. Do me a small favor, hit subscribe if you have not already, because I break these situations down the moment they develop, and you do not want to be catching up a week late. On the rhetoric front, officials on the other side have been busy this week too, dismissing what they call foreign bluster and insisting nobody has the right to restrict their trade, while claiming trading partners have simply ignored the pressure campaign entirely. It is worth pointing out the obvious tension in that kind of statement. A functioning blockade is, by definition, restricting trade, whether or not anyone wants to acknowledge it publicly. Ships are being turned around every single day, and the numbers of intercepted vessels keep climbing. Separately, officials have warned that further escalation will bring consequences, and that their hands remain untied. Fair enough. Nobody is arguing that capability has been reduced to zero. The point is not that nothing can be fired anymore. The point is that what is being fired costs a small fraction of what it costs to knock it down, and that math does not favor the side doing the firing the longer this drags on. Let's zoom out for a moment, because this is not the only front burning right now, and the parallel is genuinely useful for understanding how modern conflicts actually work. Elsewhere in the world, a similar dynamic is playing out between two other nations locked in a long-running war, where one side keeps launching waves of cheap drones and the other keeps grinding through them with interceptors. While attacks on energy infrastructure try to make the war economically painful for the side absorbing them. I bring that up not as a random tangent, but because both conflicts right now are being fought less on a traditional battlefield and more in a ledger. Whoever can absorb the cost of drones, interceptors, and disrupted. Trade the longest is the side that ultimately dictates the terms of any eventual ceasefire. Production capacity, not just battlefield heroics, is what actually decides who can keep this up longer. And it is worth noticing how conflicts like these quietly influence each other, even thousands of miles apart. Every interceptor diverted to help defend one region is one less interceptor available somewhere else. Every disruption to global energy markets caused by a standoff in one region makes oil exports from elsewhere slightly more valuable by comparison, which complicates pressure. Campaigns being run in a completely separate part of the world. None of these conflicts happen in a vacuum anymore. They are quietly drawing from the same global pool of production capacity, diplomatic attention, and energy market stability, whether the headlines connect the dots or not. So let's pull all of this together, because a single night like last night tells you almost everything you need to know about where this conflict actually stands. The first thing to understand is that direct confrontation is off the table for the side running this pressure campaign. It cannot contest a stronger navy at sea, and it cannot contest a stronger air power in the sky. What remains is asymmetric harassment, unclaimed strikes designed to disable rather than sink, aimed at driving up insurance costs and shipping delays without triggering a full-scale escalation. It knows it would lose badly. The second thing to understand is that the campaign against the alternate export route has evolved from simple harassment near a traditional danger zone into a deliberate effort to close off the one workaround that was keeping exports flowing elsewhere. Oh, that is a calculated attempt to remove the last safe option, and it is already measurably cutting into export volume. The third thing to understand is that the response, built around cheap, retrofitted rockets on decades-old airframes, is winning the cost exchange badly for the other side. Interceptors costing a fraction of the missiles they are replacing, produced in massive numbers, backed by a multi-year production pipeline, are quietly doing more to protect shipping in this conflict than almost any headline grabbing weapon system you have heard about. The fourth thing to understand is that the blockade numbers, read correctly instead of glanced at as a single headline figure, show pressure intensifying on one side's ability to move ships on its own terms, even while Allied and humanitarian traffic keeps flowing normally. That is not a blockade that is failing. That is a blockade doing exactly what it was designed to do. And the fifth thing, maybe the most important one, is that a real diplomatic track is alive right now, with outside mediators actively shuttling between both capitals, trying to find an off-ramp. But every time that track gains momentum, an unclaimed strike shows up to reset the temperature. Whether that reflects deliberate sabotage from people who benefit from the conflict continuing, or simply the natural chaos of a war fought partly through deniable proxies, the practical effect is the same. Peace keeps taking one step forward and one step back. So where does this actually go from here? Realistically, expect this exact pattern to keep repeating. Small unclaimed strikes near the Strait. Larger, openly claimed strikes further up the alternate route. A defending coalition continuing to grind down the threat with cheap, mass-produced interceptors rather than expensive, exquisite ones. And underneath all of it, quiet diplomatic contacts trying to find a resolution that neither side has fully committed to yet. Real quick, if you want the next update, the moment something changes out there and not 3 days later buried in someone else's recap, subscribing is genuinely the fastest way to make sure that happens. All right, back to it. There is one more thread worth watching closely over the coming weeks: whether other regional players start hedging their bets. Every time a strike lands somewhere previously considered safe, it puts pressure on neighboring governments to decide how much longer they are willing to sit on the sidelines. Some nearby states have already quietly increased their own coastal defenses and are reportedly in talks about shared early warning systems for exactly this kind of drone and missile threat. If that kind of regional cooperation solidifies into something more formal, it could end up being one of the more lasting consequences of this entire conflict, completely separate from whatever eventually happens between the main parties directly. A shared regional shield that outlives this specific war would be the kind of development that reshapes security across the whole region for a generation. Regardless of how these negotiations turn out, the entire theory behind this pressure campaign rests on one assumption: that it becomes more expensive for the defending coalition to sustain than it is for the attacking side to keep fighting. Based on everything we just walked through, the production numbers, the intercept rates, the blockade statistics, that assumption is looking shakier by the compare that to the other side's position. The cost of running this blockade and shooting down drones with cheap rockets is real, but it is a small fraction of a much larger defense budget, spread across multiple allies and partially offset by strategic reserve releases that keep domestic prices from spiking too badly. The other side, meanwhile, is trying to sustain a war economy under crushing sanctions with an oil sector that has been its single largest source of foreign currency for decades, while that exact sector is the one being strangled by a blockade it cannot break. Line those two cost structures up, side by side, and it becomes obvious why so much energy is being spent on tough talk, rather than an actual strategic shift on the ground. The rhetoric is the one thing left that is still cheap. None of this means the conflict ends soon. Wars fought through proxies, drones, and denial can drag on far longer than anyone expects, precisely because no single event forces a decisive reckoning. But if you are trying to figure out who is holding the stronger hand heading into whatever comes next, last night's twin strikes and the very different responses on either side gave you your answer. If you made it this far, you understand this conflict on a level most casual observers simply do not. So tell me what you think.